Easter morning stories are always beautiful. I love all the Easter morning stories in all four Gospels. But today we particularly read from St. Matthew's story, St. Matthew's account. And of course, you know what led up to Easter. Jesus was arrested, was crucified, he died, and was buried. And this is a common account of all four Gospels, but St. Matthew adds one more story. There is the chief priests and the Pharisees asked Pilate, the governor, to secure the tomb. They said, well, if the disciples steal the corpse, then there will be a problem. So Pilate gave them a guard of soldiers, and the soldiers were guarding the tomb. And that's the backdrop of today's reading. After the Sabbath, Mary went to view the tomb. And he says there was a violent earthquake because an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and approached the tomb. I don't know whether there's anybody here who saw an angel. Not likely, because the angel is invisible. Angel rarely comes in a visible form. Indeed, this is the only account in the whole of Matthew's Gospel that angel came in a visible form. And it is true in the whole Bible too. There's only maybe a few that you can count that angel was visible to human. And because it is a very rare incident, it came with great pomp, a violent earthquake and a dazzling sight. And the reason then is because this is so important occasion. The resurrection of Jesus was so important, the angel, which means actually the messenger of God came in a very strong way, in a visible way. And he rolled back the stone and was sitting on it. So this makes the sight even more fearful. The angel sitting on the tomb, or the stone of the tomb. And also, it also means that the grave was open for everybody to see. And the guards were so shaken by fear of him that they became like dead men. Why wouldn't be? If you see an angel, you'll be really fearful. Oh, what's going on here? Is God really judging me or something? That's what happened to the guards. And they were so terrified. And this also means that the account of the resurrection, although not the full resurrection, but the taste of that, there were other people who saw this than Christians. These soldiers saw the angel at this, although they didn't see Jesus risen. So there are other witnesses than Christians of the account of the resurrection. And the angel speaks to women, to Mary and Mary, not to the soldiers, because they are not really interested in the resurrection in the same way as the women were. Women came to see Jesus, so it will be good news for them. But for the soldiers, it will be bad news for them because they are supposed to guard the tomb. They might be disciplined for losing Jesus from there. So God and the angel really came to speak for women, to the women, not to the soldiers. So he speaks to the women, and in a sense it says, he is not here, for he has risen. The words really that changed the world. So great news. This is a clear declaration of Jesus' resurrection. And the angel simply declares it. Whether angels saw that Jesus is risen, we don't know. But what is clear is that no human saw Jesus rising from the dead. That's why we don't know the time of Jesus' resurrection. It can be very early at night, the night before, or it can be just before the dawn. but more likely the night before. That's why we celebrate Easter on the night before to start with. Easter day. That's why we had a vigil service last night. But anyway, the angel, nobody really saw Jesus rising from the dead, but they heard the angel saying these things, these two women. So they heard the angel saying it. And the angel says, he has risen just as he said. So the angel reminds the women that Jesus had foretold this all the way. It's not as if that God said, oh, Jesus is dead, so what am I going to do? And raise him. But it was all through God's plan to start with, that Jesus should rise from the dead. So there's another evidence that Jesus had foretold that. Then angel gives another evidence. Come and see the place where he lay. The grave was empty. The empty grave is the evidence of Jesus' risen. And therefore, that's why the empty grave is still kept in the Church of the Sepulchre in Jerusalem for people to visit, to see that Jesus is not there. Jesus is risen. So the women were given the chance to see the empty grave. Then the angel gives the command. Then go quickly and tell his disciples. Well, this is interesting because the disciples are the apostles on whom the church is built. And Jesus really calls them his main witness of the resurrection in the book of Acts. So the apostles really are the main witnesses, but these main witnesses had to hear from the woman first. So they have to hear from the human words. They didn't really see Jesus rising at all, and they saw risen Jesus later, but they first had to hear. And they had to hear from these two women, who, humanly speaking, were in the inferior rank in the church hierarchy. But the church hierarchy is not really to distinguish somebody's better, somebody's worse, or anything. So the apostles, although they were entrusted with teaching, sometimes had to learn from lay people. Same thing in the modern church today. Although I'm entrusted with teaching, some of you can teach me some things about God. That's the way that God's church works. We should really be humble to learn from each other. And the message is this: he has risen from the dead, and indeed he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there. Well, he's risen from the dead. Okay, we know that the angel has already told the woman. And the next part is that he is going ahead of you to Galilee, meaning that Jesus is going to wait for them. See, Jesus is the king, and in our conventional wisdom, if Jesus, the king, comes here to meet the king, then you should go there and wait for that. If King Charles comes here, shouldn't we just gather everybody here, maybe half an hour before, 1 hour before the king arrives here? But here, Jesus is going to wait for the disciples. That shows that Jesus is really the servant king. And he is doing the same thing now. For those who do not really believe, he waits for them patiently to believe. That's Jesus. So departing from the tombs with fear and great joy, they ran to tell his disciples. So they ran to tell the disciples that they had fear and great joy. They had fear because this is so fearful sight to see angel. So even as they are running to tell the disciples, they still had fear. Because it was hard to believe what had happened. And this shows again that these women didn't really make up the story because they were fearful. They really saw the angel. Yet, There's something more than fear, because it says with fear and great joy. The joy is the bigger part, because fear did not have any adjective before that, but joy is described as great joy. So they had great joy. Jesus' resurrection really gave them joy. This is a very joyful occasion. And as they were going, it says Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." Well, here we see how the order. Jesus didn't show himself at the tomb, but as they were going, they saw Jesus. So they first heard the news of Jesus' resurrection. Then they got commands from the angel, so they obeyed, and as they obeyed, they saw Jesus. See, this is the order that will continue even today. We first have to believe on the basis of human words, of the words that of the people who have witnessed it. Then, as we believe, we obey God, then we can see Jesus, risen Jesus. And he said, "Greetings." Well, the word is translated as greetings because it's a common greeting word even in modern Greek now, charete. But this word actually literally means be joyful or rejoice. And it has the same root as the word joy that Matthew was just describing now with great joy. So when Jesus told these people, the women, be joyful, he was saying, you are joyful because you heard this news. Now be joyful even more. Rejoice even more. That's what Jesus is saying. Because this is really a great occasion that Jesus is risen. It's something that we should be very glad about. Then he says, they came up, took hold of him, and worshipped him. That's the right response for Jesus' resurrection. The risen Jesus is worthy to be worshipped. So they worshipped Jesus. And that's what we are gathered here for, to worship the risen Jesus. And Jesus tells them, do not be afraid. Again, this word afraid comes from the same root as the fear that Matthew just mentioned a couple of sentences before. So they had fear, and Jesus says, do not be afraid. They had joy, and Jesus said, rejoice. But they had fear, and Jesus said, do not be afraid. So their joy should increase, their fear should diminish. That's what Jesus is telling them. Yes, just be joyful and do not fear. And he gives the command, go and tell my brothers to leave for Galilee, and they will see me there. Jesus calls them brothers. He's the apostles' brothers. Because now they are the ones who are going to build up the kingdom that Jesus started. So Jesus sees them as co-workers and brothers. And he gives the words to them to leave for Galilee, and they will see me there. Do you see the same pattern as the women? The apostles have to believe on the words of others first. In the case of women, the words of angels, but in this case, the words of the women. Then they have to obey the words. In the case of the women, going to the disciples. For the case of the apostles, going to Galilee. Then they will see Jesus. See, this is a pattern of seeing Jesus, the risen Lord. So, in today's reading, first of all, we learn that Jesus is indeed risen. There's great evidence that Jesus has risen. If we really accept the fact that Jesus is not a usual person, so it is not strange thing that he should rise from the dead, then there's no reason why we shouldn't accept his resurrection. Jesus is indeed risen. He has risen. And with that, we also learn that the first witnesses of this resurrection first had to believe, then only and obey, and only then were able to see Jesus. And it's the same thing with us. We have to first believe on the words of the witnesses written here in the this book, but also just passed down from generation to generation. And believing, then we obey, then we will see Jesus. For us, we have longer time because we will see Jesus when he comes back to this earth. But so that we won't be discouraged during this long waiting, we have the Holy Communion. And although we don't see Jesus, we taste Jesus. Because we partake in his body and blood while we are waiting to see Jesus, see the risen Jesus finally. And this resurrection gives great joy to believers. They rejoiced. The women rejoiced. And Jesus even told the women to rejoice even more. Because when Jesus rose, he is the king now. Our risen Lord is the king over all earth. He's ruling over us. And secondly, we will be raised with him at the last day. And we will see Jesus face to face when we are raised from the dead. If we die before the last day, of course. Otherwise, we will just see Jesus face to face, alive. So that's the great joy that we have. That just like this woman who first believed that Jesus was risen, then saw Jesus, risen Jesus himself, we will see the risen Jesus. As our New Testament reading says, when Christ who is your life appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. So let us look forward to that glorious day, believing that Jesus has risen already. Glory be to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.